So I'm going to invite Benjie de la Peña, SUMC CEO, to deliver some opening remarks.
Thank you, Alvaro, for that opening. Thank you to the SUMC team. And I hope I didn't forget anyone. Alvaro, Al, Colin, Manali, Nate, Rudy, Alex, Hanny, Ugo, and Ellen. Did I miss anyone? Did I? Okay. Lauren, who's also back there, but for putting together this thing. And we'd like to thank our partners, FTA with Karina, Guowei, and Rick, who could not be here. Guowei couldn't be here. And the rest of the team at the Office of Innovation. My job is to tell you a little bit more about the Shared Use Mobility Center. We've been around for about 8 years now. I think we started in 2014. And we have our roots in innovation, in shared mobility, in convening, in equity, in the environment, in communities, and in cities. Right? So that's what undergirds all of our work and the deep philosophy behind it. Sharon Fagan, the former executive director, I took over from her. I'm trying to fill her shoes. They're very big shoes. She founded SUMC, and it was actually, but before there was SUMC, she started and ran the iGo car sharing project at the Center for Neighborhood Technology. It was one of the first community-based car sharing companies or car sharing services in the country. And it was a project of the Center for Neighborhood Technology. The Center for Neighborhood Technology itself, CNT, has deep roots in the civil rights movement and the environmental justice movement. They were mobilizing communities here in Chicago to challenge injustice and inequity. So from their website, they started in 1978, and they were started by two very amazing people, Scott Bernstein and Stan Hallett. Scott Bernstein, if you're going to the summit tomorrow, you might run into him. He's got encyclopedic knowledge about housing and transportation. Try to get into a conversation with him and just listen. Stan Hallett, right, is actually one of those near big minor stars in the whole civil rights movement. He started with the church groups in civil rights, got to work with Reverend Martin Luther King, Alinsky, McGovern, Studs Terkel. They really moved, particularly in Chicago, the civil rights movement. And from there, their idea was, let's take knowledge about communities and neighborhoods and bring that forward to help planning and help understand the city. One of the things that they brought forward was the idea of a neighborhood economy, and that you need to recognize that. So that's where our roots are. As car sharing exploded right in the, early in the last decade, I can't believe I'm saying that, early in the last decade, CNT sold iGo. And Sharon took some of those proceeds and started the Shared Use Mobility Center. And the early board members included David Bragdon at Transit Center and Susan Shaheen, who now chairs the Transportation Research Board. She's in UC Berkeley. My own connection with SUMC was, I was working for the Rockefeller Foundation at the time. My last grant in Rockefeller Foundation was to Susan Berkeley at Susan Shaheen at UC Berkeley to convene the first Shared Mobility Summit. I remember it was my last month, and I was telling Sue Shaheen, just give me the papers. I want to write that check and get out of here. And that is the core of what the summit is, which happens tomorrow. So, we started in convening and continue to do convenings, right? And our roots, again, are in addressing neighborhood issues, equity, environment. So our partnership with FTA, Alvaro has given you kind of an overview of it, but it's been several programs year after year. And our role has been to bring together the grantees so that they can learn from each other. And that's most of you. So they told me I should wear a lavalier, and now that I'm holding this mic, I said, that was very smart. I should have just followed them. On from the MOD, of course, people working in government, we like acronyms. So it was the Mobility on Demand, and then the MOD on-ramp, and then the IMI, and then the AIM, and now the MIC collaborative. But at the core of it is taking the grantees of FTA's innovation programs, bringing them together and saying, let's learn, right? And that's how we've been supporting all of the agencies and learning for each other. So key to innovation is learning. You all know that, right? But But innovation by itself doesn't matter if we don't learn whether it's a success or failure. Again, I'm preaching to the choir on this one. One of my favorite shows, Ted Lasso. Who is a Ted Lasso fan? There you go. So Ted Lasso tells Sam, what's the happiest animal in the world? Goldfish. Why? 10-second memory, right? They only remember things for 10 seconds, so that then they're happy. When I was working in the Seattle Department of Transportation, I was Chief of Strategy Innovation. One of the things I learned clearly from the way my agency was learning was, I would describe them as, we learn as an agency the way a dog that gets kicked learns, right? You learn that we're never gonna do that again, because it was failure. But then if you ask, well, all of it, or which parts of it? And we never step back, and one of the things we're trying to do is to step back and say, which parts of it worked, which parts of it didn't. And that learning is really, really helped if you are with other partners, other people who are trying it too, other agencies, so that you can learn from their learnings too. We've got a lot of innovation still to do in the last half decade or so. It's about the technology, it's about trying it out of your communities, or the modes itself. What's next, of course, are the things that will make those innovations stick. They're the organizational innovations, they're the institutional innovations, they're the procurement innovations, which is kind of the hardest thing ever, and to get it into your budget, right? That's the toughest thing of it all. So I've been going on for a while. Well, let me mention a little bit our other project, which is the Clean Mobility Options Project, our other big project, which is in California. We're working with the California Air Resources Board. In our FTA projects, we work with about 70 communities across the country, mostly government agencies, learning from them, from you guys, as you try innovation. In California, we help run the Clean Mobility Options Program, which is helping underserved, historically neglected communities, frontline communities, try out shared mobility. And we're learning from the needs of the communities. One of the things we roll out is a community needs assessment program. You want to talk to Lauren, who runs our California program, if you want to learn more about that. So we're learning about what does the community need, and does this transportation mode actually provide it? In all of this, the question that we ask when you're starting innovation, which I often do not see, right? You try it out and say, well, the first thing you have to ask is, what are we trying to learn, right? In the end, if it fails, whether it fails or succeeds, what did we learn, right? And second, why are we trying to do this? Very often it's just, oh, well, there's new technology, so let's try MAS or whatever the flavor of the month is. But particularly in this context, with a climate crisis, with historic inequity that we still have not solved, right? And economic pressure on our households, the innovation we must try out and continue to push out has to have a reason behind it. And it has to address those issues. We do not have enough time anymore. The last IPCC report said, we're gonna miss the target. And it was, five bell fire alarm. And so I leave you with 3 notes. I've gone on for a while. When it comes to innovation. The first is know what you're trying to learn. The second is, why are you trying to do that innovation? And the most important thing, which is why we're here, is learn from others, right? The whole idea of the innovator being an individual inventor with a eureka moment, that's actually not true. A lot of the innovations happen in conversations, in coffee shops, in communities, and that's what we're trying to build with the Make Collaborative. And with that, I thank you and welcome you, and it is my pleasure. I didn't know. I get to introduce Assistant Administration of the Federal Transportation, did I just repeat that? Of the FTA, Karina Ricks.
So I'm Karina Ricks. I'm the Associate Administrator for Research, Innovation, and Demonstration at the Federal Transit Administration. I'm pleased that Rick is here. He's one of our really, really great staff, which I'm sure you've had interactions with. So this is now the workshop portion. Everybody's like, it's like church. It's like way at the back. So I'm gonna like go out there with everyone. But this is a workshop portion of it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some innovative funding opportunities. But then I want to talk a lot about what you've encountered, things that you've experienced. It's an information sharing among you all as much as it's, me presenting different options to you. Because you all, you're a scrappy group and have to kind of patch it together, right? From a lot of different sources. Many of them, unfortunately, are precluded from federal aid using those sources for the services that you present. But some of it is, again, this is about innovation, about creativity. It's about figuring out ways to kind of, flex a little bit of resources here so that other resources can be freed up for those things that are not prohibited in the federal aid system. So one of the things that I'm going to start, you all know a lot of the usual things about, hi there. You all know a lot of the usual things about partnering with developers and looking at things like transportation demand management credits and other kinds of things. I'm happy to talk about those if you want. I guess I should say a little bit about my background. I've been with the Federal Transit Administration 7 months now, but prior to that, really have been on the city side of things. So I was the Director of Transportation, Director of Mobility and Infrastructure for the City of Pittsburgh. Did quite a bit of consulting with a number of different cities and communities, nationally and internationally. Before that with Nelson Nygaard Associates, and then prior to that was the Director of Transportation Planning for the District of Columbia, which has the unique distinction of being concurrently a city and a state in federal world, which is very convenient because it turns out the city and the state are of uniform opinion about priorities. So yeah, that's very nice. So can talk a little bit about things from the city side and how you can incorporate some of these things into development agreements and community benefit agreements and other kinds of things which are really important in making these work. So I'll start first about something that we've been working on over the last few months at the Federal Transit Administration, together with our good friends at the Federal Highway Administration, is really examining the use of flexible funding provisions that exist in the federal code. So again, I came to the big bad federal government from the undertrodden cities and came and was recounting about my experience trying to do something as simple as building sidewalks. Building sidewalks logistically is easy. You go out, you tell your contractor, I need 6 feet wide, 4 inches deep, go, right? They know how to do it. Finding the money for sidewalks is a whole different story, right? Depending on where you are in the country, some places will say, oh, those are the private property owner's business to do that. Why? I don't know, since it's part of the public transportation network, but some places that's a private responsibility to do that. In other places, it can be publicly constructed, but coming up with the resources for public construction in many, many cities, you're weighing priorities and trying to decide amongst them. But trying to use federal aid for sidewalks really was just an exercise in sort of, self-abuse in doing this. So I was fortunate in working with our state to get a couple of $1 million to build critical sidewalk gaps to transit. So these were in predominantly communities of color, transit-dependent communities, higher rates of persons with disabilities, female-headed households, younger residents, potentially in strollers or vulnerable pedestrians walking by themselves on streets. This seems like a good place to have sidewalks. Sidewalks are among the highest performing safety countermeasures, right? People are safer when they're outside of the space of motor vehicles. But going through, the state process, not necessarily the fault of the state, but the state has a stewardship agreement with the federal government, and the stewardship agreements are generally written to make sure that every I is dotted and every T is crossed for multi-million-dollar huge projects that you do not want to mess up and have that money taken away from you for. So it's designed to really keep those projects going, large bridge projects, large interstate projects, those kinds of things. But those requirements, when it comes to doing something like a small sidewalk, are really impossible to get through. So as we're, banging our head time after time after time to do this, it was things like, well, you're going to need full-size construction drawings for 70 block faces of sidewalk gaps that range in length from 10 feet to 100 feet, 6 feet wide, 4 inches deep. That obviously is we would have spent 25% of the money just doing engineering drawings for those as actually constructing them. Well, you're going to need, as-builts for the sidewalks. You're going to need survey drawings for the sidewalks. Again, all of these things are just part of the stewardship agreement that the states need to bring. So in any event, it took us about 3 years and almost $300,000 to use. That was not the local match. That was the pre-construction work that we needed to do in order to use the $2 million. And at the end of the day, we did not do the 70 different sidewalks because that was not possible, even though that would have served the greatest number of people and made the most sense in leveraging the rest of our infrastructure, because we would have been addressing those gaps where the sidewalks had eroded or the trees had pushed them up, or whatever. We would have been able to cover 3 different neighborhoods, extensive areas of sidewalks. Instead, we needed to consolidate that project down to 2 corridors that still needed sidewalks, and just economize and push our investment that way. So I'm telling this story as I'm coming into the federal government, and they said, well, why don't you just flex that money to FTA? And I said, what? It was highway money, and it was for sidewalks. And they were like back in the neighborhoods, And they said, well, you can use that money and you can flex it over to the Federal Transit Administration for any pedestrian improvement project within a half a mile of a fixed route transit stop. Any pedestrian project. Sidewalks, crosswalks, traffic calming, street lighting, anything that makes it possible for people to actually get, because we want to really maximize that transit investment that we've made, that we make year after year after year. The only reason we're making that transit investment is so that people can get to it and ride it and use it. And so we need to have that, what we call transit supportive infrastructure that goes out into the neighborhood. And what's the benefit of flexing those resources? Well, Federal Transit Administration doesn't have the stewardship agreements with states. Federal Transit Administration generally gives great deference to their grantees, which are transit providers, but can also be cities and MPOs and other entities. But generally says you are the one who's going to have to maintain this asset at the end of the day. You need to follow your protocols. You have to follow Davis-Bacon. You have to do all the same federal kinds of things. But you can really use your own process then to implement these improvements. Had I known, and so now somebody said, you become quite like the evangelist for flex funding, because it really would have been a game changer. Had I known, this would have saved us about 2.5 years. And probably $150,000. That's $150,000 would build a lot more sidewalks, or would be a lot more local match to unleash some more federal investment for more of the same, right, in an 80-20 arrangement. So with Federal Highway Administration, we've recently released, I don't know if any of you have seen it, we've recently released a new resource on flexible funding. that you can use. So it's planning.dot.gov. And if you kind of scroll down there, or you can go directly, it's planning.dot.gov/flex. Go ahead.
Hey, Karina, good to see you.
Hi.
I have a question on that front, actually.
Sure.
When I used to be a planning director in a small town in Maryland, I had a lot of success with the grant program.
Yep.
With HUD. Are you looking at expanding it outside of USDOT? Looking at CDC, Active People Healthy Nation grant, because for sidewalks in particular, I was able to do a lot of reconstruction work and
Yep.
maintenance through CDC.
Yeah, no, it's a great comment, and we also, a lot of cities use the CDBG money. Again, you have to work with your local planning groups to understand, because it's all about priorities and where you're putting the money, but you can build infrastructure with CDBG funding. That funding would not be flexed to FTA, right? That funding would stay with HUD for oversight. But it's definitely, and so just building up that library, it's a great suggestion to just kind of in the other, there's a section of, the catch-all at the bottom of the website of other things. I think that's a really great comment that we maybe should provide a link to the CDBG.
Yeah, another one I would suggest would be USDA.
Oh, okay.
Not all in major cities.
Yeah, that one I didn't know. Great. So we'll follow up and we'll get the other resources from you. See, we're like working as a community already. But yeah, it's and you may know about the ability to flex funds from the CMAQ program, Congestion Mitigation Air Quality. That is not the only place for you to go fishing. You can actually flex funds from a huge array of the federal highway programs. And again, you can flex those programs for any activity that is eligible under the FTA transit code. So of course you can use it to buy, zero emission buses or van pools or, other kinds of things like that. But you can also use it for this transit supportive infrastructure. And that really underpins, so the guidelines around that is what is transit supportive infrastructure. As I said, it's any pedestrian improvement within a half a mile of a fixed route transit stop, which in many of definitely the cities is pretty much everything that you're doing in a city. But even as you get out, further away, that still covers a lot of territory of where you're going to want to have those crossing improvements, the safety countermeasures, signal improvements, any of those kinds of things. Again, these are things that are eligible under FHWA. You don't have to fund it, but you might find that you have an easier path for localities and a little bit more local control if you do. It totally depends on sort of what you need and what your local capacities are. For bicycle projects, it's within 3 miles. So any bicycle facility within 3 miles of a fixed route transit stop is considered de facto part of the extended transit system and is eligible for this kind of flexing. So that's just something that, again, to me, I consider myself a fairly informed consumer. It knocked my socks off. I'm like, what? This would have really been like a profound game changer. Again, it's not a new source of funding. You have to work with your MPOs, you have to work with your states, you do have to secure the funding through the regular calls for projects. But it is an innovative means of project delivery that can help you do that. There's also some new, with the bipartisan infrastructure law, there's some new programs that are coming online. Among them is the carbon reduction program, which I'm sure many of you have had your eyes on and probably can quote chapter and verse better than I can. But that's another one that is eligible for flexing for project delivery there. Now I have to look at my notes. Anything on just flex funding that I can add or answer? What was that?
Oh, I just had a quick question. When you mentioned the climate initiative, is that with the Justice 40, or is that a separate initiative, and is that qualify for the flex funding?
The carbon reduction program? Yeah, the carbon reduction program is part of the bipartisan infrastructure law. It is another funding program. Justice 40 is an executive order, and so Justice 40 applies to everything. And so also to the carbon reduction program, yeah. Okay? Yeah. Great. All right.
So thank you, Karina. We're gonna, so for this session, we're gonna invite the next two speakers to deliver the presentation, and then we're gonna gather again for a round of Q&A for everybody. So next, we're gonna hear from Justin Layton, who is the Executive Director of the Washington State Transit Association. It's an organization that represents 31 agencies in the state and advocate for public transit there. And Justin is going to tell us more about the recent Move Ahead Washington bill that just passed. So without further ado.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Great. So my name is Justin Layton, Executive Director of the Washington State Transit Association. We represent every single public transit agency in Washington State, about 31 members. Our largest member is King County Metro, which is one of the largest agencies in the country. They have a $1 billion operation. Our smallest member is actually a small rural county, and their annual operating budget is only $300,000. So quite the diverse group of agencies that I represent. For Washington State, most of the cost of public transit is paid for by the localities. Anywhere from 70 to 80% of our funding comes from local sales tax or the fare box, while only the remaining 20 to 15% is made up of federal dollars and state dollars. And in our case, actually, state comes in less than the federal share for the total cost of public transit. So for many years, we have been advocating for the state to increase their investments into multimodal, whether that be bike ped, whether that be transit. And my philosophy is that we've been building our infrastructure around the vehicle for over 100 years now. When is it time to start prioritizing transit, bike ped? And listening to the story about sidewalks, I used to serve on the Transportation Commission for my local city in Tacoma, Washington. And I would also fight the Public Works Department about whose responsibility is it to fix the sidewalks. And they would defer their responsibility of fixing their own sidewalks on the public transit agency, saying it was their job to do it, or it was the businesses. And when I ran for city council in 2015, one of the biggest things that I heard was from residents about their sidewalks. These 90-year-old women who are living off of Social Security, and the city would say it's their job to fix that residential sidewalk. So I really tried hard to institute a low-income sidewalk program when I was on the Transportation Commission. And so I thought it was very interesting to hear that it is a problem. Our transit riders are always a pedestrian first and after they get off the bus. You can go to the next slide. So, that's the last slide. Ooh, that's okay. Yes. Now you get the preview of everything I have. Okay, next one. Okay, so to put it into context why it matters. The last time we approved an investment package in Washington State was in 2015. It was called Connecting Washington. I was working at a public agency. I worked for Pierce Transit. I did their government relations for 5 years. And the reason why I like this is context of the priority of the state legislature. And it wasn't transit and bike ped then. At that time, we only got, from a multimodal perspective, bike ped and transit 6% of the package. And so my goal as the executive director of the Washington State Transit Association, when I came on, I told our board of directors that it is our job to ensure that we're the voice of public transit, and the next time the state goes and invests in infrastructure, we have a significant portion of that money. And our ask going into their conversations of an investment package was a little over $3 billion for transit and $1 billion for bike ped, to put it into kind of perspective. And these will be made available, right, for y'all. So I'm not going to there's a lot of tables in here, and I was told to fly through it, so I'm going to fly through it. So the Move Ahead Washington it's been a conversation for about 5 years now. Our state, I don't know how other states do it, but they like to have conversations and pass big sweeping investment packages, and then we go another 10 years, and then we talk about that, and then they do it again. Probably not the most sustainable way, but that's just how we've been doing it. This year is a short session, and it was a surprise that we actually got movement and got passed a $17 billion proposal out of the legislature. And there's a couple of big things here is in our state, some of you also, we have a lot of tribal governments. And our tribes went to the courts to sue the state over their culverts. And it was about a $2.5 billion lawsuit that went all the way up to the federal courts. And the court found that it was the state's job to fix the culverts for fish passage. We have a failing bridge between Oregon and Washington. We have ferry system. We have this country's largest ferry system. Some of our boats are 60 years old. And they're loud, and they produce diesel, and the loudness of them is actually killing the orca population that is protected under federal endangered species. These are all pressures. And then you have people like me saying, where's the money for transit? Where's the money for bike ped, right? So there's a lot of things going in there. And because of the cost of inflation, they can't meet the commitments of the 2015 package. There's gaps already. So they came together with a 16-year proposal. That doesn't mean it sunsets then, that's just their funding horizon. And what was really important was the year before this, they passed what was called the Climate Commitment Act. So Washington State was the last state on the West Coast to approve a carbon fee cap and trade program. So under the Climate Commitment Act, and I'm going to talk about that as we go forward just from that point of view, it is going to raise about $5.4 billion over that 16 years. The rest of the funding proposal comes from federal investment assumptions. There was an export fuel tax at one point. I need to update that slide. That one's no longer happening. And then because we are a sales tax state, we don't have income tax. Sales tax is booming right now. And there's a huge, huge amount of money in our operating budget. They transferred a ton of money over into the transportation budget, about $3 billion. Hit the next slide. So this is I call it the 18th Amendment protected funding. I don't advocate for roads and bridges, but that's what it does there. You can hit the next one. And then that's the other part there. Big projects, $1 billion bridge over the Columbia River Bridge into Portland. Next slide. And so I'm going to start talking about the Climate Commitment Act. Because of the 18th Amendment, we don't get gas tax. And a lot of legislators like to think that transit is a boogeyman of the transportation budget, when in fact only 2.4% of the total spending of the transportation budget goes to transit. In fact, when you do the pie chart, other is bigger than what they give for public transportation. But they like to think we're the boogeyman, and they like to pound it away. So we are never going to get any of the money that's going to come from a gas tax, or we're looking at a road usage charge. They want to make that 18th Amendment protected. So when it passed the CCA, the Climate Commitment Act, our job was to capture as much money of that as possible for multimodal investments. So here is the spending plan for that $5.4 billion. Transit is going to get $3 billion of it over 16 years, and a huge amount to active transportation, $1.3 billion almost. Safe routes to school. We're talking complete streets, connecting community grants, which is meant to historically fix the historical problems of driving a freeway through a community of color and trying to bridge the two sides, right? And for transit, they really leaned on our association to figure out how we wanted it spent. And we talk about innovation, but sometimes we just want to fund the bread and butter of what we're supposed to be doing. capital needs, service, frequency. And there was a lot of advocates that wanted free transit for everyone. And I often say free transit is great, but what's going to do if there's no bus past 7 o'clock, right? What is a free bus ride for a single mother working nights that doesn't come past 7 o'clock at night? It's pointless. So we've got to fix the bread and butter service, right? Frequency, span, weekend service. And so I'll dive into our chunk there. Go ahead. So this is how the $3 billion is spent. We plussed up several grant programs. Special needs transportation is the biggest grant program we have. In our state, over a biennial budget for the state, our members spend about $400 million in ADA service alone. The state only provides about $52 million before Move Ahead Washington was passed. We did create 2 new grants, actually 3, the tribal transit grants. But the 2 big ones are My Baby, which is a bus and bus facility grant. It's modeled off the federal bus and bus facility. Those transit agencies that are in the room know about that. 5339, low-no type of grant program. And then the transit support grants. And if you've read some news about in Washington State, kids are going to ride free after October, this is where this is coming from. And I'm going to dive probably more into those 2 grants as we go forward, because I think that's the innovative part of all of this. We also have what I often just say earmarks. These are just individually funded projects. I heard Kitsap Transit was in here. We got $7 million for an electric fast foot ferry for them in there. These are a ton of mobility projects. The problem with this, these are shovel-ready projects, but the money isn't shovel-ready. We do this every time, and I actually discourage the legislature doing this. And so some of these projects are going to have to be strewn out over 16 years. Our job is to just make sure the money stays with the agency and they can fund another project if they get it done. Go ahead. So you can look at this slide later when you get it, but this is how the money goes. The way I like to see it is, okay, we have new money. We've got $3 billion over 16 years or 8 bienniums. What does that mean per biennium? Because that's how we fund in our state legislature. But what does it also mean when it adds on top of the grant money already? This money is 1.5 times more money than the state had been giving to us. I'm actually worried that the state isn't going to be able to have the resources to administer the money because they didn't give any more FTEs to the Department of Transportation to work on these programs. But as you can see, it's a huge influx of more money into different areas. And the big chunk of it is the transit investment program, the transit support grants. It's a $1.5 billion over that 16 years, or $181 million. And if you go to the next slide, the bus and bus facility grant program, here's the particulars of it. I basically, when I helped write the legislation for this, took the federal version and just made it that. There's a couple of caveats in there. There's a cap. King County Metro is so large that they would just suck up all the money if there wasn't a cap. They produce almost 70% of the ridership in their entire state. Go ahead. So the transit support grant's probably the most flexible. My job, my transit agency general manager said, Justin, don't get strings attached. There's a lot of folks that want to use this money all for free transit for everybody, or they want to dedicate it specifically to service, evening service or weekend service. But I know that that's not how transit planning works. So the goal was to get it as basically used as possible, which was transit capital or transit serve operating, and that's it. But the caveat is, to get this, you have to have a zero fare policy for 18 and under by October 1st. That's the big caveat there. And we needed to make this a significant pot for agencies to do that, to ensure that they're not just going to cover the fare that they would lose, but then some at that point. So go ahead. So here is every single one of my members, all my kids. I love them equally. I don't have favorites. And I want to give you a couple of perspectives in here. I pick on King County Metro. They're going to get $31 million out of this. That's at their 35% cap. They estimated close to about $10 million a year that they collect in revenue from kids. Now that sounds terrible when you say it out loud, so no wonder we're doing this, right? Like, how much money do you make from kids a year? So about 31 million. So they're going to get a delta of about 20 more million a year on top of this. If you go over and look at Valley Transit, if you ever heard of the Walla Walla Onion, this is where that's at, Walla Walla County. They get about $50,000 a year off of their youth ridership. They're getting $500,000. If you go to my alma mater, Pierce Transit, they are going to get about 8.2 million. They only earn about $800,000 a year off of youth. So they're getting almost like 8 times more money than they'll be losing. And they can use this on transit, service, capital, replacement, expansion, whatever they want. And it's up to the locality to do it. Go ahead. The big caveat here on this is all of the money has to be tied to overburdened communities, whether it's our transit support grant or it's a ferry being rebuilt by this money, the Climate Commitment Act money. What does overburdened communities mean? The department doesn't know yet. They're defining it. It was left pretty vague in the legislation. So we have this program with the Department of Ecology that looks at all these disparities, whether they be health, air quality, water, socioeconomic disparities. So the department is looking at if you're in a community of 7 or more, you're in an overburdened community. And the goal in the legislation is 40% of the $5.4 billion has to go support overburdened communities. I'm not convinced this is going to cut the mustard in my mind. I'd like us to look about who has access to a working car? What is the household income of our riders? How many people live in that household? When I worked at Pierce Transit, over 54% of our riders didn't have access to a working car. So I know that we're helping that sector of our community. We just need to do a better job understanding who our riders are and articulating to not just the grant administrators, but our community of how we're helping them. I often say we get too caught up in data in transit. We report to the NTD and this and that, but I often say for every data point that you want to spill out there, whether it be cost per service hour or ridership per average weekday ridership, there's a human story to every single data point. Go ahead. So we met the ask. We got 18% out of the proposal. Before, for transit alone, it was just 4%. So, this was job security. When I go and ask for my increase in my salary for my board, I'm going to say, I just got you $17 billion. You can afford maybe a 5% increase, right? So it's a huge deal. I will say I'm working harder now getting it implemented with everybody and getting them to understand the rules than actually advocating as the chief advocate for the state. Go ahead. This is what's next. There's a lot that have to happen. The zero fare is quite interesting for agencies. The biggest challenge right now is how do we verify that they're 18? And do we want the driver to be doing that at the door, which we do not want. We don't want our drivers getting in fights with people, whether or not they look 17 or 19, right? So there's a big deal, not unsolvable problems. But it's something that a lot of agencies some of them are fare free now, and so they're walk on, walk off. So how do you know if they're 18 or not? Because we have to track that and give that to the state at the end. So that's all I got. I think that's the last slide. Yep, there's that. So we'll be here for questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Justin, very much for that presentation. And last but not least, for today's morning session, we're going to be hearing from Will Schroeer from East Metro Strong, which is a public-private partnership in St. Paul, Minnesota, and that is working with businesses, cities, and communities to have better transit investments as well as providing more mobility options. And we're very excited to hear his presentation today because it coincides with the launch of this amazing project. So thank you and welcome, Will.
Thanks, everyone, and thank you, Justin, for that inspiring work. Fantastic, and thanks to SUMC for having me here. That's the mic's working well, et cetera? Very good. All right. So innovation in funding. But I want to tell you about what we funded before I tell you about how we funded it. So we're going to start with the project, then we'll get to the funding. Back up one more time, Colin. All right, next slide. Thanks. I'm not used to having someone run the little clicker. So the fundamental problem, and thanks to Karina and to Benjie for reminding us we have to know why we're doing what we're doing. Fundamental problem, people can't get where they need to go. They buy cars. They can't always afford to buy those cars or to maintain them. You're probably all familiar with the problem of not just buying the car, but maintaining it and insuring it, ongoing cost, very troubling. And that burden falls most heavily on folks in low-income neighborhoods, of course. First, how do we meet some of those needs? I came out of a let's get people out of cars kind of world. And when the idea came to us, let's build a car share system to address some of the transit gaps, I was like, geez, I've been trying to get people out of cars and you want to fund more cars. But I'm going to talk to you about how those two things work together and how we funded it. Colin. And I want to start with a big thanks to SUMC because they helped identify the needs in Minneapolis and St. Paul that we turned around and are now addressing. SUMC wrote the Twin Cities Shared Mobility Action Plan 5 years ago, talked about all of the needs in shared mobility in the cities. Transit is the biggest form of shared mobility, and there are a lot of other needs: bike share, scooter share, car share. Getting to transit on the sidewalks is a form of shared mobility, right? SUMC did a fantastic job, and although we have had car share in the cities for many years, it has always been hub-based car share. Take it out at the hub, bring it back to the hub. And SUMC identified the lack of one-way and free-floating car share as a fundamental gap in our shared mobility system. So thank you to SUMC for helping identify that gap. Next slide. We are addressing that gap with 3 related services, not just one new car share system, but 3 related services. And I'm going to go through them quickly. Colin. So the first and most important is publicly owned car share. Some of you may be familiar with Car2Go, which was a free-floating one-way car share system owned in part by Mercedes-Benz of all people. And they were in Minneapolis and St. Paul for a couple of years. People really liked them, and then they pulled out. And we can talk about why they pulled out, but they did. And we were committed to having a community-owned car share system, so we were not at the mercy of corporate decision makers who didn't live in our community. And next slide. What that looks like is we addressed a number of needs by making sure that we located our service in underserved neighborhoods. And half of these areas are what we called areas of concentrated poverty, with especially half people of color. We don't use that term anymore, but it's still descriptive. So half of the service area is in those neighborhoods. If you know Minneapolis and St. Paul, it's the northeast side of St. Paul and the northwest side of Minneapolis in particular are those poor neighborhoods. 38 square miles service area. You can pick up and leave a car anywhere in this service area. You find it on your phone, and you can travel outside the service area. You just have to bring it back to that area. And they are free floating. We have 100 cars out right now. We're waiting for our shipment of 70 Leafs. It's hard to get cars, as you know, these days, but they're being built for us as we speak. Next slide. Because these are electric cars, we needed a place to charge them. And we don't have great charging infrastructure yet in the cities, certainly not enough to serve 170 new free-floating cars. So we had to build an EV charging network to support those cars. You don't have to bring the car back to the charging hub. You get a little incentive if you do so. You get ride credit on your next ride, but you don't have to. And while we were putting in the charging hubs for our cars, we also put in additional chargers for people who own their own EVs. And extra equity angle there is that a lot of folks living in apartment buildings, no way to put a charger in their own residence, right? Or it's a lot harder to work with the landlord. We wanted to remove that barrier to owning an EV if you can afford your own private vehicle. We have on-street now public charging spaces for you. Yes?
I have a question. Is the EV spot charging stations proprietary to EV, and then you did another charging infrastructure, or are they the same?
So, great question, thank you. At each EV spot, there are two-head EV chargers, only for EVs, and two-head chargers for everyone else. And conceivably, you could charge your private car at an EV charger because it's the same technology. It's just signage, right? And it's harder to make it work with, there are not charge card readers, et cetera, on the EV heads, right? So each of the 70 EV spots has four chargers, two for EVs, two for the public. They're level 2. We are it's harder to get fast chargers. We have plans to install 12 fast chargers on top of the 70 level, 140 level 2s, but they're coming. Good question. Yes? Is it free? No. Just a funny story, and Alvaro told me I had a little more time, so I'm going to drop in a funny story from time to time here. A number of these are on the University of Minnesota campus. 60,000 kids in the University of Minnesota. I shouldn't say kids, a lot of them graduate students. On the U of M's electricity grid, U of M has its own utility agreement with Xcel Energy, which is the regional private utility provider, right? And so they get an enormous bulk discount. Xcel says you can't resell that cheap electricity that we're selling you. So you can't charge for electricity on the campus, even though we're charging everybody else for electricity outside the campus. So those are free. Just interesting little quirk. Absolutely. So, any other question about the EV spots while we're taking questions? And we have a little bit of time in the back. Yeah.
Speaking of the utilities, were there any locations where you had to upgrade or the utilities had to upgrade the grid to accommodate new?
Absolutely. So we had a goal of making these EV spots sort of equally spread out through the 35 square miles, right? So it'd be easy to walk within a reasonable amount of time to one of them, and to put them near transit stops, et cetera. I'll talk about it a little more. Then the reality sets in of where you can actually put them, right? And talk about, some of the real life challenges. The electricity grid has to be able to support it. There can't be a sewer line there. There, parking, et cetera, curb cuts, blah, blah, blah. So where they ended up was not always the case, but yes, we had to upgrade it. And Xcel Energy, and I'll talk about that in the funding, but I can't say it enough, Xcel Energy, incredible partner in this, and they paid for all of the make-ready that goes up to the chargers. Yes? It's competitive. I'm a lot more interested in the cost of the car share than the charging, but it's competitive. Yeah. All right, next slide, Colin. I mentioned we're integrated with transit. This is not a competitor to transit. This is a additive to transit. And so we wanted to make absolutely sure that you could connect to and from transit, whether it's a first mile, last mile, or you're doing something else. This is not a road map of the Twin Cities. This is a map of Twin Cities bus lines and that serve the whole region. So even though our service area is just the 35 square miles in the two downtowns in between them, we are a regional service because you can take the bus in from one of the suburbs, go to work. If you work downtown, you need a car during the day, you can use an EV, and it is a regional service. And we have a great collaboration with Metro Transit where you can actually, first you have to sign up, of course, with EV. We have to run your driver's license, make sure you're a licensed driver, et cetera. Once you've done that, though, you can use your Metro Transit fare pass to open an EV car. Yes?
Can it also pay for the electricity?
We pay for the electricity. So we pay for it. So it's, yeah, absolutely. Next slide. And then the third solution that we've launched is multifamily car share. This is not free floating, but you need a certain density of uses and people to make free floating car share work. And we don't have that in a lot of the inner suburbs, certainly not in the outer suburbs. So we have launched a pilot where we're putting round trip cars in multifamily housing parking lots. And so they're still public. You can use, anybody can use them. You don't have to live in that apartment building, but they're on private land. And we are hopeful that that will be a new model for how to bring this option into places that can't support more traditional car share in dense areas. They are branded differently, yep.
But it's still EV?
It's still EV, yep, absolutely. And you can plug them in if you drive into town. I mean, these have 200-mile ranges, so you shouldn't need to plug in all the time, but you can, absolutely. Next slide. So those are our three related services. Now I want to talk about how we planned them. We made arrangements with 10 community-based organizations, neighborhood councils, other nonprofits in Minneapolis and St. Paul to work with residents of their communities to understand their transportation needs first, before we told them about car share. Understand, how are you getting around? How are you not getting around? What trips can you not make now because transit doesn't run at night, et cetera, right? What Justin was talking about, well, it runs until 7, my shift gets off at 10, et cetera, right? Understand their needs, then ask, would a car share system help meet those needs? Yes, no, what would it have to look like? How much would it have to cost in order for it to be useful to you, et cetera. And I want to, I don't know if you can see my third bullet there in terms of the needs, but this is something that, and I liked what Karina said, I'm a informed consumer, but I didn't know. This is a little twist on that. I've been in this line of work for a long time. I understand travel diaries and trips you can't make because you don't have the car, the transit, the bike, the sidewalk, et cetera. What doesn't show up in those surveys is the lack of dignity that people feel because they can't get where they need to go. They have to rely on other people. They have to make really hard choices. One woman told me, the bus does go to the doctor, but it's so unreliable and it takes so much time that a 10-minute car trip, a trip that you could take in 10 minutes, takes me an hour and a half by the bus, right? Because I have to leave early. If it were on time, I could maybe take a 45-minute bus ride, but I can't rely on that and I can't miss my doctor's appointment. Bottom line, I have to take off a half day of work to make my doctor's appointment, when if I had access to a car, it could be an hour off of work, right? And sometimes I can't take half a day off of work, so I don't see the doctor. And so I don't want to miss the doctor's appointment, so I have to ask someone from my neighborhood to drive to my workplace, take me to the doctor, take me back to my workplace, then they go back to their home. And I can't do anything, they're happy to do it, we're good neighbors, but I don't have anything to give back to them. And I have a driver's license, but I don't have a car. If I had access to this service, not only could I drive myself, I would have more autonomy. I could give back. I could give rides to other people. I would feel not such a burden on my community. And we heard so many of those stories, and just the additional dignity that this service would bring to people was very moving to me. Next slide, please. So, benefits. People can go where they need to go with dignity, with autonomy, with safety. It's clean because it's electric. And I want to underline, I know that car share is not a new idea. We have car share folks in the room here today. But what moved me to join with this project was catching up, and Susan Shaheen, big shout out to her for leading a lot of this research. Each car share vehicle replaces between 7 and 14 privately owned cars. That is huge. That is absolutely huge. And we're seeing that with some of our memberships already. And it saves households substantial money. And we started planning this a long time before the current inflation in automobile prices and gas prices. But now that it's in place, it's very timely. Next slide. So now we're going to talk about the innovations in funding. And we managed to fund the actual capital out of it, but before you get to that, you have to have a project to fund. And how do you plan and do all this community engagement right? First, philanthropy. And so big shout out to the folks that helped fund the early planning on that. And we got planning funds from MnDOT through their Sustainable Transportation Advisory Council. Basically CMAQ funds, but we didn't have to fight with all the other CMAQ projects in the state to get those funds. I don't know what your states might have that is similar to we call it the STAC, Sustainable Transportation Advisory Council. But if there is some sort of path in your city or state to access those planning funds, extremely valuable to start planning a project like this and do the community engagement. Next. And then the capital. So Xcel Energy started with a commitment to spend up to $4 million building all of the necessary infrastructure up to the chargers. That commitment got us into so many rooms. Because if Xcel Energy is willing to spend that kind of money, then we are going to take you a lot more seriously, right? I'm telling you this not because you live in Xcel territory necessarily, but because Xcel's interest is an interest that every electric utility in the country, I believe, has these days. They want to sell more electricity. They want to do it in clean ways, and selling it to you to run an electric car is certainly a clean way. Xcel has a regulatory requirement in Minnesota that they gradually clean their generation mix. And they're doing a lot of that with windmills. One of the fascinating things I learned during this project is that the wind blows a lot harder at night. Had no idea. And so they need to sell that electricity to something that's going to use a lot of electricity at night. And that's when everyone is asleep and stuff is down. How can electric cars charge overnight? So they had a real interest in setting up that I see some clapping back there. That is an incentive that I think a lot of utilities have, so I hope that's useful information to you. Armed with Xcel's commitment, we were then able to get money from what we call our regional solicitation, which is all the different kind of federal funds for transportation that go for transit, for bike ped, for basically non-road purposes, all come into one big pot, and we have to compete for it in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And we competed for that for the first slug of capital for the cars and chargers. We also have some interesting money from the Department of Energy. It's not terribly innovative to apply to the feds for funding, but with all of the interesting new funds and funding streams that are coming out of the federal government, I encourage you to look hard at those programs. This was a new program out of DOE that didn't exist before, and the innovation, I guess, was just reading the catalog of federal funding very closely to make sure that we were on top of opportunities, and they came through with $6 million for us. So, and then we got money just straight out of city budgets. Because Minneapolis and St. Paul are committed to equitable transportation, and this is equitable transportation that they can fund. They don't have to beat Metro Transit over the head for new kinds of services. They can take action themselves. That was a compelling argument to the cities. Next. So, a lot of different, and this isn't even all of the partners. I haven't listed all the community-based organizations we worked with, but a lot of folks came together. We've raised $15 million to launch this project, and it's on the ground. It was soft launched in February with 30 bolts. We now have 100 bolts. Just on Friday, we had a U.S. Senator and both mayors do an actual formal launch of the service. Beautiful day in front of Union Depot and in front of our one of our big transit hubs with light rail and buses to reinforce that connection with and addition to transit. We have 3,000 subscribers already, and we're off to a great start. So again, car share is not a brand new idea, but community-owned, all-electric, free-floating car share is empowered with 100%. I didn't mention Excel has committed to feed all of our chargers with 100% renewable energy. So we believe that is new, and it's the only one that we know of in the country. So that's an innovation, and then putting all these folks together to help fund that. I don't want to sort of leave you with the impression that you have to get 12 different agencies together to fund something like this, but it is doable, and we hope to be a model for other people. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. And I want to invite all three speakers to join us here. We're going to sit and chat. There's going to be also a mic around for questions from the public. So first of all, thank you all three of you for sharing your experience and great presentations. And I want to start with a question that touches a little bit, where we're coming from in terms of funding innovation projects that used to take more of the shape of pilot projects, right? So we're kind of at this crossover moment of critical juncture where we've been having many pilot demonstration projects for many years, and we learned a lot, and we are happy to share a lot of those lessons learned. But it's a good time also to ask, what's the path forward? So very broadly, and I know that you have different experiences depending on the level of government and partnerships you're. But the question is, what is the future for funding for demonstration projects? Are we done with those? Are we looking into investing more in long-term programs and then innovation happening through them, or are we still thinking that there is a value of keep testing and demonstrating pilot at a smaller scale and then learn from them and try to expand as we move forward?
I think there's still going to be a need for demonstrations. I mean, we're certainly not done learning, I don't think. I don't think we've done all there is. And so, but I do think that we need to get beyond demonstrating sort of the same thing, and just sort of fishing from that pot for the federal aid, fishing from that pot to replicate what has already been kind of a proven approach in one place to do it again. I know all of our cities and places are unique in their own rights, but there's a lot of transferability. And so the point of the demonstrations is to learn, is this a viable approach? Maybe we do it in a couple of different contexts, but if it works in both of those, now we have to work on that kind of bringing it into socializing it more broadly across the country. But we do need to, part of that demonstration needs to be thinking about what is the long-term sustainability of a program like this. We can fund initial operations in particular when it's a demonstration project, but that is not a sustainable approach. That is only for the duration of the demonstration. But there's also likely to be a lot of transferability among those innovative operating plans that then can find replicability. These are all very complex words for me today for some reason, in other places. So,
I mean, for the public sector, I've always worked in the public sector. I used to be a high school teacher. I feel like there's a double standard about the public sector trying something new versus the private sector. And if the private sector wants to be innovative and try something and it fails, there's no really major outcry. But if a public agency tries something and it fails, like the general manager is getting fired over that, right? And so I think that there's a real fear in leadership, both at the elected level and at the administrative level of trying these new things. And when I hear this conversation, I think about EV, like the electrification or the zero emission transition. And we have a lot of agencies in our state that are big and small, and a lot of my mid-sized agencies are just waiting for the other agencies to figure it out and be like, where did things go wrong? If King County Metro, of an operating budget of $1 billion, wants to kind of play around with electrification and it screws up, it's a little easier to kind of do that in a $1 billion operation. But if my smaller rural agency, a $5 million operating budget, and they screw up on 3 electric buses, that's like almost their entire annual operating budget. And people are getting fired over it. So I do think that there's still the fear out there, and at some point we need to kind of, from the top down and bottom up, be okay with the public sector demonstrating and failing, because that's how we learn. But it's also about these opportunities of sharing. I was just talking with Jacob back there from Florida. He's working on an autonomous vehicle shared project. And we are just now having that conversation in our state at the Transportation Commission level. And I was like, you should come out to Washington and talk about that project, because I think it's important to have lessons learned. So I don't know if I really answer the question about whether it should be long-term programs, but I do think that there should be opportunities for agencies to do these things and not have to pay the repercussions over it. But that's not what the public sector sees. They just see wasteful public dollars. And I don't think they're wasteful, but I think that a lot of the general public who are struggling to put food on the table and trying to get from A to B see that and get frustrated with that.
And then I promise
Absolutely.
I will wait. But just to what Justin is saying, I do just want to call attention that the USDOT recently, in the last several months, released the innovation principles. And so it's really saying at the federal, one of them is learn from failure. Like go ahead and try. And as long as you learn from failure, or learn from success also, I suppose. But I think that that's an important, what he's saying is really important, and there is a lot of shyness to fail, and of course, money is much smaller and more closely watched the lower you get on the food chain. But I do think that it's an important message from the federal government that we have your back if you want to do this, and we encourage it. Sorry.
Not at all. You're absolutely right. Well, just among us here in the room, I'll share that the answer to whether we're a demonstration project depends on who we're talking to. So Department of Energy, our grant is a demonstration project to DOE, and part of the funding is to write up our processes so that we can share them with other people, and that's important, and we should absolutely do that. But we don't describe it as a demonstration project in the community. It's just a service, and in fact, the reason it's community-owned is so it won't go away. I mean, someone asked me once, what happens if this fails? Do you pull all the chargers out? I'm like, no. If somebody doesn't drive on a road a certain number of times, you don't pull up the road, right? Those chargers are there. Maybe we should. No, I couldn't agree more. But so it depends. One person's permanent project can be another person's demonstration project. I guess that's all.
Nice.
Sorry, is that a matter of scale? I mean, I think the aversion to trying new things comes from it being $1 billion project rather than a $100,000 project. So are these demonstration projects scaled down to make it more like just a neighborhood, or is there flexibility? Is there the opportunity to ramp up if the demo, the smaller version, succeeds?
Part of the challenge with that, and I think this is true for a lot of things, certainly true for car share, but I think it's true more generally, is that there are, you have to have a certain scale for things to work sometimes. And so I certainly urge people to not start too small and then draw the wrong lesson from that. Well, no, we didn't get enough use. Yeah, because it was too small, right?
Yeah, I've seen that in some sandbox grants, and where I live is they tried to do first last mile with a sandbox grant, and I looked at where they drew the map of where you can pick it up and what time to pick it up. And I was like, do you know, I need that first last mile at 10 o'clock at night. I can take the bus from downtown Seattle to Tacoma, which is a 45-minute bus ride. But I land in Tacoma where there's no bus. But they didn't offer the first and last mile program at that time of night when I would actually could use that. Now I'm just sitting there waiting for my own Uber, you know, from that point of view. So I think sometimes it's, you know, it is like you draw this box around yourself and you're trapping your own innovation within your own box that you've created.
I'm going to ask one more question, and I'll open to the public. But so when we think about innovative funding, it could be innovative sources of funding, right? Looking at, you know, where else should I look for money, right? And but there is also another approach, which is how do I create, you know, innovative partnership or innovative ways to look for funding that may be already there or maybe coming up that I haven't looked for, right? And thinking about, you know, many times in, you know, in transit agencies and so on, like we're looking at, you know, set number of funding opportunities, and sometimes, you know, part of the being innovative is being creative and develop those partnerships, you know. So I have two questions related to that, and the first one is, you know, here are some experiences here going on in terms of developing those partnerships, but what do you think has been, you know, most promising, you know, areas or partnerships, you know, for transit to be able to expand, you know, the reach and their service, you know, supported through different sources of funding? And the second part to that question is, what do you think are the organizational capabilities that transit agencies currently, you know, may be lacking of, you know, to enable, you know, the creation of those partnerships? Do you need to, you know, what do they need to do to be better prepared, you know, to tackle into those innovative funding opportunities?
Well, I'll start on this one if I may. So I mentioned that we got funding from Minneapolis and St. Paul out of their regular city budgets. And typically that doesn't happen for mobility projects. That's the transit agency's job, is to provide mobility, right? And depending on who we were talking to in the city, of course, we talked at different angles. It's good for your climate plan. It's good for your equity plan. It's good for getting people to and from work, and you have a, you know, workforce issue, right? So all these, but we spoke to the city's goals, and it's not that we're trying to raise money for transit. Oh, that's Metro Transit's job. We're trying to raise money for, you know, advancing your climate goals, advancing your workforce goals, et cetera, right? So, and now we're getting calls from suburbs who want us to expand into them, and we're gonna say, Minneapolis and St. Paul paid, you pay, right? And don't send us back to the state or to the feds for expansion money. You want the service, you know, chip in. In a way, you know, asking people to pay for a new service is not particularly innovative, but it is, in my view, in the transit world, because again, well, that's Metro Transit's job. And no, we think it's everyone's job.
Oh, we're just going down the line. Well, lots of thoughts are going through my mind about the, you know, innovative partnerships that are necessary. I think, you know, and again, coming from my history is on the city side of things, I think actually there is, there's some, like the sidewalk example that I used, of things kind of getting lost in between space, in the interstitial space, right?
Yeah.
That, you know, you're saying transit authorities are the mobility authorities. Well, maybe they should be, but they're not. And you all,
Right,
you know,
right.
know from
Sure.
the things that you've done,
Sure.
right? We like
Right.
to categorize things neatly into, you know, buses and trains, that's transit, van pools, maybe transit,
Right.
transit leaning,
Right,
you
right,
know,
right.
bike share, definitively not transit, according to regulations, but to
Right.
ordinary people it is. Anyway, and then, you know, sidewalks, like that's the city's problem, or
Sure.
the private property,
Sure.
or someone else's. So,
Sure.
I mean, I think we are going to function better if we're able to take some cues from, our neighbors to the north or our neighbors to the south, where, many Canadian cities have gone through an agglomeration process where they are able to kind of collapse some of these distinctions, both jurisdictionally as well as other responsibilities, so that you can really look at all of the different funding resources that you have available and kind of apply them very strategically and break down some of those silo barriers. I know it's easier said than done to do this, but I think that, but it's something I think that would really be well worth some really strategic discussions happening at something maybe the sub-metro area, since we know that a lot of our MPOs around the country are massively big and don't always have the same characteristics among their partners, but a definitively urban area of them, and really looking at, can we collectively look at the resources that we have, the funding restrictions that are behind them, and be truly strategic. And maybe what we can find is that if we can tap some of the capital restricted funds for these activities at the city level, that might free up some of the less restrictive local money for operations. Not everybody has an operating surplus, by the way.
Right.
But that, I think that that's someplace that we really need to, and maybe start thinking, going back to your demonstration question, start thinking about some governance demonstrations in addition to just sort of, service delivery demonstrations, talking to myself of what maybe we should do. So.
And I'll just add in, when the economy's bad, when your sales tax base, it's not great. So Great Recession hurt us quite a bit, which goes to like just funding the basics, right? Where our agencies are still trying to rehabilitate their capital that they deferred during the Great Recession. I have some agencies still working out of a wood kind of structure, almost like a barn, right? And they don't have that capital need for it. But I have two examples of, it's about the barriers and almost the systemic barriers of government that had put into place. Public transit agencies have this charter regulation against them, right? And so if a public agency wants to provide a specific service to an entity for whatever reason, they have to kind of work around these charter regulations where they shouldn't compete against the private sector. We have one of the largest fairs in the country in Washington, and they wanted this special fare service, and they wanted the public agency to do that. And it was like trying to figure out how to do this great need. The taxpayers pay for public transit already through their sales tax, but the federal government regulation on charter rules is preventing them from doing it. And so you have to write this RFP, you have to send it out, and if a private entity bids on it, then the public sector is out, but they can't provide the ADA type of service. So there's some of these barriers out there for it. Going back to the partnership, I helped when I worked at an agency, this trolley project. For whatever reason, small towns want just like this circulator in their town, when I'm like, I think people just want to get to work outside of your town. But they really wanted this like very cute trolley thing. And I'm looking at kids at Gig Harbor, right? So this loud trolley, they wanted it. And for us to be able to do it, we asked the city to fund it. This kind of uptown like business district at the theater was a partnership of it. The Chamber of Commerce helped paid for it, type of thing. But we had to break down all of these governmental barriers of, can an agency accept money like that? We don't have foundations. Agencies can't accept money sometimes for that way. They can do interlocal agreements, but they can't with the private sector. They can with the city. So the city was collecting money and kind of funneling it through. So basically, we were laundering money just to provide this trolley service in the small kind of harbor city of it all. And so I think that there's just some of these, I'll just point to, the government has put on these restrictions on top of us, and we need to identify them and work hard to break them down to be more nimble and innovative.
Yeah, I love that point about the changing the governance. I think that it's fundamental. I know that Karina, you did a great job also in Pittsburgh, innovative in that regard, and how this obviously enable different funding also to support projects, but also programs and partnerships. So let's see if there is any question from the public.
Thank you all so much for sharing today. My question is to Will. You mentioned the Nissan Leaf was the car that you folks were using. I think I heard that correctly. Is that?
We have 100 bolts out right now, and we're waiting for 70 Leafs. One of the things that and I don't mean to talk down demonstration projects because there are a lot of things to learn from them. One of the things we learned is that you don't want to have a fleet of all one kind of vehicle in case they get recalled. Yes.
Really, my question was this: neither the Volt people nor the Nissan Leaf people were involved in the funding at all?
We got some startup funds from GM, and I probably should have had them on there, but it wasn't. I'm very grateful to GM, don't get me wrong, but it didn't rise to the level of some of the others.
I also had a question about the EV program. How did you decide how many vehicles you would need?
Very good question. We studied other folks' car share programs, and our partner, so all of this is owned by the two cities, but we have contracted with the local car share nonprofit. I mentioned it had been in operation for some time in the cities with a hub-based system. We've contracted with them to operate it. So they had some experience on how many people you can serve with one vehicle. We studied other regions' car share systems. Again, the research at Susan Shaheen's shop has been very valuable there. And so the answer is we drew on other people's experience.
Is there a monthly subscription? Is that how for users? And then what do people need to do to comply besides just having a credit card?
So you have to sign up ahead of time. You can't just decide you need a car right now and walk up to it with a credit card because we need to do a background check and make sure you're licensed, et cetera. That's mostly automated. There are third-party background check folks now. But we still, I don't do it. Staff look at every application, which can be time consuming. Anyway, you have to have a driver's license and you do have to have a credit card that we can bill. We are trying to work on a workaround for the unbanked. That's coming, but right now that's the case. And then there are 3 tiers of membership, one of which is low income, and you can join for no monthly fee on our lowest tier. Like a lot of other things, you can join for more higher monthly fee and then cheaper minutes, or you can have no monthly fee and then more expensive minutes. We also have overnight plans and weekend plans. We're trying to address mobility not just around the region, but also open up access to things that you really do need a car for. Our state parks, for example, are almost all reachable only by car in most cases. Some of the cars have state park passes on the windshield. So different, I'm not trying to avoid your question, but we have a lot of different rate plans depending on what the target is.
And then do you do any background checks on their driving records at all?
I think yes, and I don't know what the cutoff is. If you're, have too many points, you don't get a membership, but we do check, yeah.
That's one, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
How does the locking mechanisms work? In other words, how do you start the car, or how does that,
either with the app or with the, it's all app. Most of it is app-based. You can also get into the car with your Metro Transit card,
Okay.
but mostly it's connected to our app. Yeah.
Hello, Omer Varba, Sargon National Laboratory. I also have a question for Will. Do you have any before, after metrics in terms of the increased ridership for transit or door-to-door travel time and things like that?
We have some of those in place. We're adding more metrics as we go. One of the learnings has been that it's harder to write an app than you might think that it is. I'm sure that won't be news to a lot of folks, but it was news to me anyway. And we wanted to balance knowing about our users and what they're doing with ease of use and not setting up barriers. So for example, signing up for our low-income plan is self-declared. We don't ask to see a pay stub or anything. And there was a lot of conversation about that, as you might imagine. And we decided we're going to err on the side of ease of use and accessibility, and making you upload whatever or go downtown to prove X was the opposite of those things. So, yeah.
I'm going to ask follow-up questions on the metrics side, and that touches also a little bit of what you presented earlier, all of you. So we're also discussing a lot of how this innovative funding fits within broader equity and sustainability plans, right, for different.
Yep.
And so briefly, with the Shared Use Mobility Center, we've been working with this type of questions, like we developed the emissions calculator tool, so people can assess, what are the impacts of bringing shared mobility to their cities, or including for the Clean Mobility Options Program in California that Benjie mentioned earlier, there is a clear definition of disadvantaged communities based on equity and environmental metrics, and the funding is channeled to serve directly to those communities. So the question back to the metrics is like, what do you think? What is the role of metrics related to equity and sustainability being part, or more of a requirement as part of innovative funding, for mobility looking forward?
We do have established equity metrics with the cities as part of our funding agreement, or rather, the cities contract with our car as the operator sets certain performance standards. If you have so much participation from underserved communities, then you get a bonus in the contract, et cetera. I believe the way our car is going to do that, since we don't ask for demographic information up front, is we'll survey users afterwards to get a sense of who's using again, it's this balance of, we don't want to provide a barrier up front, but we do need to know, we want to know. I mean, this was part of the pitch, was this will serve underserved communities, and we need to know if that's actually working, and if it's not, then we need to change something. But we're going to learn about that a little bit after the fact.
Yeah, I mean, somebody mentioned as we were talking about the Justice 40 initiative, and for those that don't know what the Justice 40 is, it's the executive order that said that 40% of the benefit of a federal investment needs to accrue to historically disadvantaged or disinvested communities, both urban and rural. So that is something that the administration is really working to gather that information, not just as for many of the discretionary grant programs that are coming out across not just USDOT, but DOE and the many different programs of the federal government. Justice 40 still applies. And so you're asked to explain where the benefit is accruing for your program, and then there is then a preferential evaluation for those programs. But we're really looking now, how do we follow up on that? How do you track that information? Within FTA, we've had continuing conversations that will continue still about the principal measure that we have for transit performance, which is the National Transit Database, which maybe is not giving us as fulsome of a picture of what the real benefit of transit is and for whom. And so talking about what are other measures that we can gather that really capture the good that transit is doing, more so than just kind of just numbers of people that are on the buses. It's not talking about that, or transit generally. It's not talking about the
who.
Right, the who, or is there economic mobility that's following this transit mobility?
Right. Exactly.
One last pitch I'll make with this question is that, and Rick is at the back and can talk to you about it later, is one of the other demonstrations that we'll be putting out soon that we're just crafting is one talking about transportation insecurity, which is the notion we hear about housing insecure and food insecure. A lot of people are transportation insecure, that, you know, they're just one missed bus, or, you know, their toddler throwing a tantrum, or whatever it is, again, away from losing their jobs, or certainly losing the opportunity for a raise or a promotion or something else. And so we really want to measure this and really do some good scientific work to see if we're able to address and give a firmer foundation of true mobility, meaning that you've got resiliency. It's not just a bus-based mobility that you have, but while that might be your principal mode, that we can build some redundancy and we can build some cushion in. And if we do that, what then will we see in terms of other performance metrics? And so that's something that we'll be putting out later this year or soon, depending on the rapidity of the federal government churn. So.
Yeah. There's other questions. I mean, I agree with all of that, especially the who's riding the bus.
The conversation's gone in a lot of different twists and turns, but I had a question based on something you had said about just the struggle of accepting failure and the risk, the very real risk within the public sector of accepting failure, a little easier in the private sector to do that. And also your mention about Car2Go, which is a great example of that. BMW's Reach Now was another example of that, where 2 car sharing programs got quite integrated into communities and then pretty suddenly shut the switch off. Yep. So I was curious about how the P3 approach is managed or can be leveraged to both mitigate some of those risks, but also manage or oversee the responsibility they have to communities as they go in and test these pilots and demonstrations. Because we're very much still in the Wild West stage frontier of testing and piloting and demonstration. So I was curious how P3 relationships are set up or looked at from those perspectives.
I mean, I don't have a lot of experience doing it myself, other than a couple of projects I helped on when I worked for a public transit agency. But from what I kind of know, for example, is, you know, you really got to get the trust of your elected board and, you know, the community and the private side that you're working with. You know, I see a lot of large agencies trying to do these type of things with TOD projects. And, you know, they have this public land, and how do we sell this public land to do better for lower income developments, right? Mixed use developments. And, you know, sometimes they really fail. And it's really ensuring that you're really bringing the elected people around, because from a public transit perspective, it's that elected board that needs to have the trust of the team to do it, and working with other local governments. So, you know, are you working with the housing authority? Are you working with the city on a TOD type of project like that? And then the other thing is also scale of magnitude. Not every agency is built the same and can do the same project. And so I think that there's a misunderstanding that, well, that agency over there did something, why can't we do it? And it's like, well, the dispatcher is also the clerk of the board, who is also the HR person, right? So, you know, I've got a lot of general managers who will miss a meeting and because they'll be like, oh, well, our drivers are down, so I have to go drive the bus. Like, a lot of my general managers have to have their CDL as part of their thing. So this is really just about, do you even have the skills and the human power to do such a project? Mm-hmm. And that's why we see a lot of the bigger agencies have that ability to do it. Whereas maybe your mid-size, I think the FTA would categorize them small agencies, 100 bus or less type of agencies, just really aren't quite there yet. Yeah.
I have a question about when do we make something permanent and what constitutes permanent? Because I think too often an agency gets a grant, they put in a demonstration, and then that's where it stops. I think mobility providers have showed us what constant innovation means, and then sometimes agencies overregulate that and get in the way of innovation. But like, from a safety standpoint, which is a lot of the work that I do, I think too often we're putting in paint and flex posts, and then we're wondering why pedestrians are still dying, because that's not going to stop a car from hitting someone. So like, from a transit standpoint, and I think, Justin, your work, like, I think your group can help, like, beyond one grant to try something out, and then it just stays forever. It's degraded. It's not providing the same service it once did. So what does that look like to you all?
I mean, to me, it's, I try to get folks to get away from the word efficiency. I think we're too centered around the term efficiency. Government doesn't always have to be efficient, but it can be effective. And so I try to say effective and efficient. Is your project efficient? Is that the goal, or is it to be effective? And the effective might be just getting a human from point A to point B. To me, it seems like, have you met the metrics that you've set for yourself on both of those levels? Are you spending $150 per customer to provide that trip? Is that really the most effective way to deliver the taxpayer dollars? But is it the one thing that that community needs? And it's harder to serve a rural community because the ridership isn't going to be there, right? Density really matters in public transportation. But they might need that mobility access. So one of my smallest members, they have a shopper shuttle that once a week comes into town, and they deliver about 10 90-year-old women into town to go shopping. And it's a 60-mile one-way route in and one-way back out. It's expensive to do that, but it's very much needed for these people to live in place, age in place, and have the mobility they needed. So to kind of answer your question, I think it's setting yourself a standard of not just the metrics that go into the NTD, which is obnoxious at times, to be honest with you, because it doesn't tell you who's riding the bus, but it does have to, I do encourage people to develop community-based metrics, right? Is this what our community needs? Are they effective? And who are they effective for? I mean, what is really the goal here? Is it to help overburdened community? Well, if so, what does that look like? If it's to help a senior population, if so, what does that look like? It's not ensuring 5 riders per service hour. It's ensuring that these people get to their pharmacies or their grocery stores.
I think, and having, again, kind of alternating between my city hat and where I'm at now, we're not good at setting end dates for when a demonstration is over. But it's really important, both for public trust to say, like, we're really just going to try this. And even if it's successful, we're going to stop here, and then we're going to make the decision for the true permanent improvement, going from tactical urbanism to actually build. And sometimes that's what you need to do to get the resources to build it. So we, again, in my past life, we had some very successful pilot projects that were flex posts and paint. But that's not enough, because it really doesn't provide true protection. And in order to get the resources to do it, we had to actually remove them. There was wide public outcry about how terrible it was that we removed it, but that was what enabled us to get it. The converse, I think, is also true, is that sometimes it's really hard for us to say goodbye, to your point of, like, there's a reticence to fail, that, like, we just let these things kind of limp along and continue when really we should have just stopped them. And either recalibrated and launched it as a new thing, or just said it's okay, but it's not really what we want. Maybe we should try something else. So I think in terms of demonstrations, being really, really clear about the end date and actually having it end. That's the hardest part. We don't like to say goodbye, but it's having it end and then making a conscious decision for that next phase of it. The other part of the pre-planning of demonstrations is knowing, and I know SUMC's done some really good work, is knowing what your off-ramp is. How are you going to get off of this? How are you going to wean people off of this demonstration that you've done? either transitioning it so that you're lining up that permanent money, or so that you can somehow still accommodate the mobility needs that the demonstration provided, even if you now cut off this particular demonstration. But we're still learning, I think, to do demonstrations really effectively, and those kinds of things are really hard, and it takes a lot of foresight. You get so excited about the tests that you're going to do that you're maybe not thinking about the whole life cycle, and in particular that ending of a demonstration.
And to add to it, if I may, it's to get to your point about funding. I really encourage agencies not to go into a demonstration living just off the grant, because what are you going to do when the grant goes away? And I really discourage our operations to be funded by grant dollars, because the grant dollar, we might have a completely different legislature in 4 years, and they might take this money away. So this is why when we talked about the transit support grants, I didn't want it tied to direct service elements. There's some folks that wanted, you had to prove a higher frequency in your service by 15%, or you have more weekend and evening service, and that's nice, but what happens if that money goes away? And so when you go into a demonstration grant, are you gonna be able to fund that if it's successful? Because the demonstration grant is for demoing, not permanentization. And that demo grant is meant to go demo more money somewhere else. And so if it's $1 million operation, in 2 years when you're done, do you have that $1 million to keep it going? And I think that is a big struggle. I think too many agencies see this money and be like, ooh, we could try this new thing, and not really thinking, well, how are we gonna keep funding it if it is successful? What are you gonna take away from the other part of the system to do that?
I'm gonna briefly insert a footnote, and we're wrapping up this session, but we've seen during the MIC program, many of the projects that were intended to do some demonstration projects in one way were affected by the pandemic, as everybody else. And it has been very interesting to see how agencies have been recreating their own timelines or the project design, sometimes the partnership, so it's interesting to think about, this, what you're suggesting, Karina, about the end goal and the timeline, but then COVID happened, and it has been magical to see how, new demonstrations within the demonstration, like not only this is what we want to do, but can we do it with these circumstances that were not part of the original plan, right? And I just want to, do a shout out for all the transit agencies that have been participating in the MIC and program, and have been, innovating, on the fly with their own demonstration projects. Will, any last? Okay, so we're out of time. I think that it has been great for this conversation to end on the note of how to go beyond transit ridership counts, because that is exactly the topic of our afternoon session. So we're gonna break now for lunch until 1:30. We're gonna reconvene here for that capturing ridership data beyond traffic count, transit counts at 1:30. And we want to thank you, Karina, Justin, and Will, for sharing their expertise with us today.